With it getting dark around 5 p.m. and as the year just generally comes to a close, sometimes I get the early winter blues and like to listen to my favorite nostalgic video game bangers. There is one specific chord progression that I find appears disproportionately in my nostalgia benders, and since there's actually a lot of depth to this progression, let's talk about it, along with some other variations just for fun. But either way, hopefully you guys hear your favorite nostalgic video game tunes at some point in this video. It's been taking me so long to make this video because every time I listen to any of these songs, I get stun-locked with memories of a bygone era. Before we get into a bunch of fun chord progressions, a word from today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by boot.dev. I've tried to get into coding a few times in my life, but after about an hour of staring at variables and strings in a textbook, I found myself looking like... But what if you could learn coding in the context of video games? Boot.dev offers a variety of different courses for different programming languages, the lessons and hands-on coding all in the style of a fantasy RPG. You can level up, grind quests, collect achievements, and even fight bosses, so to speak, among many other familiar game mechanics that help to make learning how to code super enjoyable and engaging. And all of this isn't just for fun. You're learning real-world back-end development skills with industry-standard programming languages, like Python and JavaScript. But that isn't to say it's not super fun though. I'm not even joking, I intended to complete just the introduction chapter before working on this part of the script, but I was genuinely having so much fun that I ended up in chapter 3. After all, taking concepts that seem daunting and making them accessible through contextualizing them in video games is kind of the entire idea behind my own channel. So if you like these videos, video games in general, or want to learn coding in a fun way, hopefully you'll give boot.dev a try. Go to boot.dev and use promo code CadenceHero to receive 25% off your entire first year on the annual plan. Link is in the description. So let's talk about line cliches. What is a line cliche? In the purest sense, it's this figure in music where we have an otherwise static chord, while one of the voices moves up or down chromatically. Most commonly, we see either the top voice of the chord moving upwards like this, or the bass moves chromatically downwards like this. For our purposes, we're going to focus on the latter. I would say we can really only call it a line cliche if the bass goes down at least 3 times, and doesn't break that chromatic downwards movement before then. But that being said, so long as it keeps going down, there isn't much of a hard limit to how long a line cliche can be. Though typically, we'll step down a maximum of 6 times, before stepping up to bring the chord progression back to home. We can see this in the most standard line cliche progression. What I absolutely adore about this chord progression is how we get relatively complex chords out of seemingly simple movement. The bass just descends by half step, and the notes on top aren't even changing, but we still hear a new chord created with each bass move. I do consider the descending line cliche chord progression to kind of have a loose definition though. So long as the bass descends chromatically and the chords over top at least maintain the spirit of the original progression, I think there's a lot of room for cool reharms that take advantage of that juicy bass movement. After all, music theory is what we hear versus what is on the page. If the vibes are there, then sometimes that's really all you need. So let's take a look at some tunes. A really good example of the 4-chord perfect descending line cliche can be heard in the Mother title screen. So beautifully simple, but so effective. The bass walks down chromatically as expected, and those upper voices maintain the B and D through those first 4 chords. I think much of the power of this 4-chord version of this chord progression comes from that 3rd chord. The other chords are all diatonic, they don't break out of the key. But this one with that F just has so much pull, which takes us into that skeletal E minor chord. It's so intimate and emotional. The chords are so minimal and implied that it really has to just rely on the simple movement of the bass for its identity. But that makes this such an inspired overture for this game. Rather than alluding to the aliens, psychic abilities, and wacky characters, this tune scores the emotional heart of the game, a coming-of-age story and the enduring power of a mother's love. We can hear the 8-chord descending line cliche in Cave Story's Mimiga Town. kind of interesting. Rather than the 3 diminished we get on the 3rd chord in the perfect line cliche, we break it a bit to get the more stable flat 6 major on the E flat. This then walks down to the B flat over D, and then the D walks down to the D flat to give us that classic heartstring pulling 4 minor chord on the start of phrase 2. I would argue that this chord is where the power is in this chord progression. That classic 4-4 minor is baked into this chord progression. The drop from our 4 into the darker, warmer 4 minor is just so sappy, but it really just hits you. Another thing I love about line cliche chord progressions in general is the elegant usage of chord inversion. People always ask me what the point of inversion is, and I think this is probably one of my favorite use cases. In a very general sense, the bass likes to hit the roots of our chords, so the bass movement kind of has to just jump around as necessary. But since the smooth downwards bass movement is the point of the descending line cliche, the chords have to kind of bend around that, giving us inversions, chords where the bass isn't playing the root of the chord. Even these simple diatonic inversions feel so good, a mild layer of complexity that sounds lovely on its own, but of course also serves to voice lead that bass downwards. Listen to our chord progression without inversion versus the one with inversions. The former's fine, of course, but that bass movement in the latter makes everything make so much sense. We maintain so much momentum throughout the 8 measures, because even though we return to our 1 chord, the F, multiple times, we're hitting them each in an inversion. These inversions are not quite as stable as the non-inverted counterparts, so we can just blaze right through these inverted 1 chords without feeling the catharsis of resolution, only getting that when we loop and return to the beginning. So cool. But we also don't have to hit a bunch of 1 chords. We can further leverage the fun non-diatonicism of the descending line cliche to create a more interesting and varied chord progression. This progression spices up our descending line by adding secondary dominants. We reharm the 2nd chord to just be our 5. Nothing super interesting there. But then we get the 5 of 4 in chord 3, which is still just our 1 chord, but the bass has moved down a whole step. Afterwards, we get the 5 of 2 with the G, which goes into our 4 minor we usually have, and then the inverted 1. But here, rather than the sharp 4 minor 7 flat 5 we have in Mimiga Town, we get another secondary dominant with the 5 of 5. Overall, the result is just more momentum and more power. We lean into this driving, descending bass and lightly reharm the chords to have more tension. I'll talk about why I think it appears in Evergrande City in a sec, but first let's take a listen to one of my personal favorites, the Mario Galaxy credits theme. Not anything we haven't seen before, kind of a mix of the simpler version with some secondary dominant reharms. Something I haven't said previously that we've already seen and will see a lot more of is this pattern where we break the harmonic rhythm, giving us 2 chords in the last bar, either a 2-5 or, as we see here, the 5 sus going into the 5. Just another one of those momentum things, I suppose. It's more intuitive to place the 5 on the tail end of the progression where the tension of the phrase is strongest, rather than wait for the entire bar to resolve. But anyways, one big unsubstantiated association I have with this progression is endings, or at least the feeling of the downswing. From a composer standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. The falling nature of the progression mirrors the falling action of the narrative, things coming to a close. Evergrande City is the final city you arrive at before you fight the Elite Four. And this theme is, of course, the credits theme of Super Mario Galaxy. Part of what I think makes this chord progression so nostalgic is that bittersweet aspect. The credits or final area of a game mark a wonderful journey coming to an end. The chords in this progression flip between diatonic, major and cheerful, to these dark minor key derived flat 6 and 4 minor chords. Kind of a perfect mirror to that feeling. And it's this complex, bittersweet emotion that I feel is so formative in your youth, and really sticks with you into adulthood. A vague recollection of musical falling coupled with narrative endings. It's for this reason that, at least personally, I consider this chord progression to be so nostalgic. Just don't think too hard about the first two songs we looked at being the title screen music and starting town theme respectively. But I do want to use Mario credits themes to talk about another progression that purists will say definitely isn't a line cliché, but I would argue still maintains the spirit of the descending bass and other conventions we've previously seen, and still gives me a very similar feeling. At the very least, we can call it a sibling progression of our descending line cliché, the Canon Walkdown, seen rather quintessentially in the Mario 64 credits theme. Right off the bat, we can see the similarities. The bass walks down, but this time diatonically. If we isolate the bass notes, it's just the major scale walking all the way down, but hitting the 5 before we fall back into the 1 to restart the progression. We also have our familiar inversions, which are necessitated by the bass walkdown. I would say the biggest difference between this and the chromatically descending line cliché is the absence of non-diatonicism. All of the chords are honestly pretty expected and inoffensive. As a composer, I think that's the strength of the Canon Walkdown. You can kind of get a similar flavor to the line cliché, but it's a much kinder and more inconspicuous progression. You can put this chord progression under pretty much anything and it'll probably sound decent. I call this the Canon Walkdown because the chord progression is a mild reharm of the pickleball canon chord progression, which I've already done a pretty long video on, so I would recommend watching that guy if you want to learn more, such as the Canon Walkdown's iconic usage in... Another side note before we move on from our Mario credits themes is that these themes love using these descending chord progressions. Take a listen for yourself. Almost every single credits theme from every Mario game until Odyssey contains some type of descending chord progression. It's pretty cool to see, even between the different composers throughout the series, that trend seemed to stick. Okay, but looking at more Canon Walkdown tunes, I really like how DuckTales' Moon theme handles the progression. It starts exactly the same, but after we get to our 4, we subvert the diatonic walkdown, instead stepping up chromatically into the sharp 4 minor 7 flat 5, and then the 5, much like what we saw in Mother Earth. It's a good reminder that of course chord progressions aren't rigid. You can absolutely use half of the Canon Walkdown and then step up chromatically. Though it breaks the walkdown, we still maintain stepwise bass movement, and the effect is inserting a bit of non-diatonic spice into the progression for voice leading, which adds just a bit of wonder and the spirit of exploration to the Moon theme. Which, by the way, is the de facto final level of DuckTales, giving us another kind of ending theme. I have one more example of the Canon Walkdown with a cool, spicy reharm, from a game many people have been asking me to talk about, Miss Victoria from the horse game. The progression is played pretty straight until we get here. Typically, we would walk down another whole step to the 2, which then goes to the 5 and then restarts the progression. But instead we walk down a half step to the flat 3, giving us a bit of a dark push right into our usual 5 directly afterwards. Nothing especially crazy, but another great instance of the modularity of these descending chord progressions. You can try mixing and matching half steps and whole steps to come up with your own unique descending chord progression. There's a lot of really interesting and viable options. The same, however, cannot be said for this build though. What are these level 1s doing with Kita-san Black? But thus far, we've only looked at major key examples. We can also do the exact same descending line cliché thing, but starting on our 1 minor. It's pretty cool. It has a similar dramatic quality to the major key version, but with it being in minor, it definitely is much darker. A pretty textbook example can be heard in the battle theme for the edgiest character in Pokemon history. I love this theme so much with that slap bass kind of thing going on. Like we were talking about, the chord progression starts on our 1 minor. Though it's a super involved bass line, it does ultimately just walk all the way down every downbeat until we break the perfect line cliche by hitting a D over F sharp, our 5 of 5, before going into our familiar 5 sus and a 5 kind of thing with the G7. We get some interesting chords from the minor key version that are of course absent in the major counterpart. The second chord is this G augmented over B. You can technically call this B augmented, since augmented chords can have any of the notes as the root. But I think it makes more sense to call this an inverted G augmented, as it functions loosely as our 5 chord. This chord, along with the 6 minor 7 flat 5 and especially the 5 of 5 in minor, all really play into that characteristically hyper melodramatic kind of sound. Which works wonderfully for Gladion, this traumatized kid who overcompensates for his weakness by pretending to be cool. He is kinda cool though, I have to admit. We can see another variation of the minor descending line cliche in Heracles, my favorite song from the hit one-button rhythm game A Dance of Fire and Ice. This one is almost exactly the same as Gladion's theme except for this right here. Typically we walk down to the inverted 1 chord, which allows us to continue the momentum until the final 5 chord, which loops us back to the beginning. But here we just walk down from the root position flat 6 into the root position 5, which resolves as expected to the 1 chord, which holds for these 2 measures. The movement of the chord progression dissipates instantly, which is an interesting effect. This moment in the level marks a transitional section between the 2 harder rhythms. The chord progression resolving seems to be a deliberate choice, a moment of respite before this part that I mess up every time I play this level. Gosh dang it. There is a pretty unique variation we can hear in Undertale's Save the World. What I really like about this one is how it's tonally brighter than the usual minor descending line cliche. We hit that 4-7 instead of the slightly darker 6 minor 7 flat 5 we saw in Gladion's theme, and then walk it down normally until here. Typically if the bass walks down to this point, we get the really dramatic 5 of 5 which then steps up into the 5 then back to the 1. But here we walk down to the much warmer flat 5, and then walk that down one more half step to the 4 minor 7, which forms a 2-5 kind of movement that wants to pull us into our major tonic. In other words, it's kind of a snippet of the major key in this otherwise minor tune. And I love this so much because it's just a little bit counterintuitive, but perfectly matches this scene, this climactic moment where you're fighting Azrael to determine the fate of your friends and the rest of the underground. The beginning of the progression starts intense and melodramatic, much like the usual descending line cliche, but that major shift near the end just feels so hopeful and fills you with determination or something. But my favorite minor descending line cliche in video games has to be Mipha's theme from Breath of the Wild. Otherwise a typical construction of the progression, but we break the line cliche here, going down a 5th to the B flat for that powerful sub-5, which displaces our 5 chord to the following measure. You could also think of the sub-5 into 5 move as a classical Neapolitan chord movement, where we set up our 5 with the dominant 7 chord a tritone away. The movements are just so simple and elegant. What I love about her theme is how it contrasts with the more typical intense final boss usages of the progression. It's so gentle and tentative, especially that 6 minor 7 flat 5, but it also feels so tragic, the theme of unrequited love and a terrible fate. Haunting, and at least for me, was the champion theme that stuck with me the most from this game. Entirely unrelated to the video topic, but one cool musical Easter egg that I'll probably never get to talk about ever again is that Royal Zoras are named after the solfege syllables do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, and ti. King Dorephan is the combination of do, re, and fa. Sidon uses the more international syllable si in place of ti, in combination with do, and mifa is a combination of mi and fa. Using fixed do, where do corresponds to the note si, mi and fa would be the notes E and F, which is exactly what her main motif is, repeated throughout her theme. You can even hear Sidon's theme doing the exact same thing with the B and C, which I won't play because I'm getting way too distracted, but take a listen for yourself. Super cool stuff. Much in the same vein as the major descending line cliche, we can also Swiss cheese our minor descending line cliche, alternating whole and half steps to get a looser, albeit still descending bass progression. I wouldn't say there's necessarily this comprehensive paradigm like the Canon Walkdown in minor, as rather anecdotally, these minor key descending chord progressions are a bit more varied, and each variation less common than the standard line cliche. But still, you can find examples of literally the Canon Walkdown except it's in minor. This one is great. Much like the Canon Walkdown to the major line cliche, this minor Canon Walkdown does retain that feeling of the minor descending line cliche, but tempered a bit. A bit less tension compared to those non-diatonic half steps. The perfect major Canon Walkdown steps down entirely diatonically, just going down the major scale. Likewise, the bass of the minor Canon Walkdown just walks down the natural minor scale, jumping up a fifth to the 5 before restarting the loop on the 1. It's strangely not super common in video game music, at least off the top of my head. There are definitely some other tunes that I'm just completely blanking on, so for this one especially, please drop some in the comments. The much more common descending minor line cliche-ish progression has got to be this one, seen in the Giants theme from Majora's Mask. It's like almost a perfect descending line cliche. We go down in half steps except for that first interval, which is a whole step. Otherwise, most of the chords are pretty much what you would expect in the regular line cliche. Much like the other broken line cliches, I think this chord progression is a nice middle ground between the super serious descending line cliche and the minor Canon Walkdown. Especially with that super classical resolution at the end, it really captures the gravitas and power of these ancient creatures who come together to stop the moon. But of course, there is one final iconic example of this progression that you're probably already thinking of before I even say it. What I really like about Megalovania's usage of this chord progression is that it's the only example to really leverage the composite minor, non-diatonic descending quality of the bass to lean into a kind of bluesy sound. The melody hits that flat 5 scale degree on each repetition, giving us more or less the blues scale over the chords. It's a super Toby Fox kind of melody, and overall a usage that sounds simultaneously serious, but also a bit fun, perhaps a great mirror into this fight with Sans. I feel like I have to make a Megalovania joke or a Sans joke or something, but I'm completely blanking. Let me think. Well, that's all the tunes for the time being. As always, post your favorite descending line cliche tunes or line cliche-ish tunes in the comments. I wasn't lying when I said these are some of my favorite chord progressions of all time, and I hope they can be yours too. I do have a few more ideas for line cliche adjacent videos, so keep an eye out for those in the near future. There is one specific variation that I'm planning on making a full video on. If you liked this video, smash that subscribe button, give a little ring-a-ling to that bell, and consider joining the wonderful people who already support me on Patreon. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go back to practicing my Gladion maxing. I really feel like I'm starting to become Gladion.